Learning Objective 2 addresses the topic of equivalent units of production and how we calculate these equivalent units. So first of all, what are equivalent units and how do we calculate them? Your textbook gives you an example of trying to break down, if you'll notice in this illustration, if we try to break down the total cost, okay, all of the costs that incurred, notice it says during the period in a particular department or a particular process. So remember, with process costing, at the end of the period, we've got two different things that we can do with our cost. Either all of the costs that were taking place, for example, in mixing our crayons, all of the mixing costs that are complete will get transferred over, okay, to Department 2 at the end of the period. But in process costing, the process is usually never entirely complete. So there will be some cost that will remain in Department 1, the mixing department for crayons, at the end of the period. These are the cost of the units that are not completely finished yet. So we have to be able to take these total costs and break them down into the cost of goods that have finished the first process and the cost of goods that need to remain in that first process until they are complete. So your book gives you a good example, and I have pulled the exact text here for us to read. When we have to split these production costs, okay, be careful. We can't simply take, as we did in job order costing, the total cost that have taken place in the department during this period and divide it by the number of units that we started in this process to get a unit cost, because as we see in this illustration, some of the costs are complete and they need to be moved. Some of the mixing is completed. All the material, labor, and overhead for that process need to move to the next process, molding. But some of the product that has been moved into the mixing department has not been completed. And those cost of material, labor, and overhead need to remain in the mixing department until the process is complete. Okay, so what we see here is that the unit cost of the completed units obviously should be more than the cost of the incomplete units. So how do we divide these costs in between the completed units and the incompleted units is where the concept of equivalent units of production comes into play. Now you may need to go back and review this slide a couple of times to try to get into your thought process why we actually need equivalent units. Okay, some of the costs in the department will be finished, some of them will not. How do we decide which cost for material, labor, and overhead get moved to the next department, and how much of those costs have to remain in the existing department or process until they are complete? So in essence, equivalent units of production. We're basically saying we need to know the amount of materials, okay, or cost that have been added to partially completed units during a period, but we're going to express those costs in the terms of fully complete units. Okay, do I need to say that again? I'm sure I do. It confuses me even sometimes. Okay, we need to know the cost of the partially completed units, but we are going to express the cost of those partially completed units in terms of the equivalent units of production of fully completed units. Okay, so bear with me. We'll work through this as we go through the chapter, but this is what's taking place. Now, in process costing, most manufacturers that are using process costing incur a very small amount of direct labor in the process. So in the process costing system, we simplify things a little bit and we combine direct labor with overhead cost and simply call these costs conversion costs. Okay, so as we're moving through the process costing system, instead of tracking materials separate from labor, separate from overhead, we're only going to track materials and conversion cost. The conversion cost will include labor and overhead. Okay, it just simplifies it for us a little bit. So we're only tracking 2 categories instead of 3, but we're still tracking material, labor, and overhead. Okay, so I think your book gives us the very best and the most simplistic example of conversion cost and how these conversion costs turn into equivalent units of production. Your book uses this example. A young boy is helping his father in the garden, and he is carrying buckets of water. But he is small, the bucket is heavy. So his father only fills the bucket half full. We get the picture here. Okay, so we're just simplifying this manufacturing process to a young child helping his son in the garden. If he comes home at the end of the day and he tells his mom, I carried 6 buckets of water to the garden. Did he really carry the equivalent of 6 full buckets of water to the garden? No. Our story tells us that his dad only filled the buckets half full. So even though he did make 6 trips, he only carried, here's our term, the equivalent unit of production, he only carried the equivalent of 3 complete buckets of water to the garden. Simple math tells us that if we take 6 buckets or 6 trips and they're only 50% full, then that process that included 6 trips really only generated the equivalent units of production of 3 complete buckets. Okay, so once again, we need to understand, first of all, why we need equivalent units of production, and we need to understand that these equivalent units of production will be made up of material and conversion cost. The conversion costs are simply your labor and your overhead combined. All right, but since the process costing system really never leaves any one process completely empty, in order to determine the costs that need to move from one process to the next, we have to separate those costs in each process based on the total number of units that were finished and the total number of units that need to remain in that process. But in order to do that and calculate and to use total cost divided by the number of units produced, we have to turn those number of units produced into the equivalent of completed units.